People are counting on us. The galaxy is counting on us.
Solo, we'll figure it out.
We'll use the Force. That's not how the Force works.
Sure, but then how does it work? The Force is one of the defining aspects of the Star Wars universe, but what it actually is, or does, or where it comes from is incredibly vague. So much so that, for some fans, moments where the series tries to add specifics to that ambiguity or provide a different interpretation of its mechanics are seen as points of no return for the franchise. So, what is the Force? What's the right way to show it? How does it work? By now, the story of the making of Star Wars is pretty well documented. In the early 1970s, George Lucas wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie but couldn't secure the rights, so he invented his own sci-fi universe instead, which became Star Wars. Some of Lucas's earliest known work on the movie is 2 pages of handwritten notes from 1973 titled The Journal of the Whills, which, like its name would suggest, takes the form of a diary entry. The actual content of the journal isn't really important. In fact, the whole format and much of the text is taken word for word from Edgar Rice Burroughs' novel, A Fighting Man of Mars, with Lucas's own made-up names replacing the ones from the book. Burroughs' series used Burroughs himself as a storytelling device, presenting the books as tales told to him by a family friend who had gone on a series of adventures on the planet Mars. Rather than Lucas casting himself as the storyteller, though, he invented the Whills, whose journal contained the story depicted in the movie to come. The name of the Whills comes from the idea of willpower, or willing things to happen, and was the first inkling of some sort of higher power in Lucas's new universe. A few months after Lucas wrote these notes, he put together his first outline for the movie itself, and set aside the Burroughs-inspired journal entry for a riff on 1958's The Hidden Fortress. This version of the story follows a grizzled 33rd century general as he helps a princess in disguise to escape her embattled home planet and seek aid among the stars. And although Jedi were mentioned in Lucas's first notes, there's no mention of them here, and the only potentially mystical element in the outline is a note at the very end about the story's heroes having risen to the status of demigods, though that's probably not supposed to be taken literally. When Lucas actually sat down to turn this outline into a script in 1974, his rough draft saw the return of the Jedi, though they were still only mundane, if highly skilled warriors. There were a few mentions of the Force of others, but it was treated only as a bit of world building. None of the characters make any mention of it outside of a greeting here or there, and it has no impact on the story, which is still based around a Hidden Fortress-style escort mission. Things develop further in the second draft from 1975, which opens with a prophecy from the Journal of the Whills, making its first appearance since Lucas's handwritten notes 2 years earlier. This draft also greatly expands on the Force, with both the Jedi and Darth Vader using it to gain powerful abilities. Another change in the story is the removal of the princess, who's been replaced by a magical crystal that the protagonist needs to take to his estranged father, who is a powerful Jedi warrior aiding the rebellion against the Empire. In this version of the story, all Jedi are descended from a holy man known as the Skywalker, who discovered an energy field that he called the Force of Others, which he believed influenced the destiny of all living creatures. And although the Force of Others granted him a powerful aura which gave him mystical abilities, he discovered that there was an evil part to the Force as well, and decided to only teach his own descendants in the hopes that they would be strong enough to resist the Force's dark side. Eventually, as the Republic became more corrupt and changed into an empire, one of the Jedi fell victim to the spell of the dark side and began teaching a clan of Sith pirates how to use the Force, resulting in the Jedi being hunted nearly to extinction and the power of the dark side growing with each Jedi death. In this draft, the Force actually has a tangible effect on the day-to-day operation of the galaxy. In places where the dark side is strong, people are quick to anger or given to hopelessness, and the only hope for good vibes to triumph is a mystical artifact called the Kyber Crystal, which can intensify the power of the Force and must be kept out of the hands of the Sith as Luke Starkiller delivers it to his father. And while the Kyber Crystal does raise the rebel pilots' spirits enough for them to successfully fight against the Empire's battle station, the Force doesn't come into play at all during the attack's final moments. Rather than shutting off their targeting computer and trusting the Force, the pilots of the final bomber must rely on C-3PO's superior robotic brain to make the necessary calculations. But other than being missing from the final battle, the Force, its effect on people, and its connection to the Jedi just kind of appear fully formed here. There was about 6 months between the writing of the first and second draft, so plenty of time for Lucas to come up with additional ideas for the movie, but why didn't he do that in the year between the story synopsis and the rough draft? What happened in 1974 to make George Lucas discover the Force? Well, Carlos Castaneda published his book, Tales of Power. See, in the early 70s, George Lucas lived with a bunch of other filmmakers and artists in San Francisco, right when much of the hippie movement was transitioning to New Age philosophies, and things like vibes and crystals would have been at least at the periphery of his everyday life. Carlos Castaneda was a big name in the New Age movement, even being featured on the cover of Time magazine in 1973, so it made sense that Lucas would eventually discover his writing. Tales of Power is the fourth book in an allegedly autobiographical series that follows Castaneda as he studies under a Mexican shaman to become a spiritual warrior and learn to harness his own personal power. Though Castaneda's works are now widely discredited and considered largely, if not completely fictional, they were still highly influential during the time of their publication, and Lucas has cited Tales of Power a number of times as an inspiration for Star Wars. And when you're reading it, that's pretty obvious. Within the first handful of pages, the shaman Don Juan refers to people as luminous beings, a term Lucas would lift directly from the book for The Empire Strikes Back. So as Lucas moved from the second draft to the third, he inserted even more references to Tales of Power, with Castaneda's shaman Don Juan inspiring a new character named Obi-Wan, who serves as a spiritual mentor to Luke. The third draft also elaborates on the Force a bit more than the second, containing an early version of Obi-Wan's energy field speech and adds even more details that were eventually removed from the script. In this version, the Force radiates specifically from a person's stomach, with the good side of the Force being on a person's right and the dark being on their left, ideas which are also lifted and modified from Tales of Power. And although it's not an element of Castaneda's writing, the Force seems to have more specific intent in the third draft as well. When Luke asks if he could learn to feel the Force, Obi-Wan only says that it's not a human decision, implying that he can only feel the Force if it wants him to. This draft also depicts the Force as a video game-esque finite energy reserve. As explained by Obi-Wan, when a creature dies, its energy remains in that place, and a Kyber crystal can be used to collect the energy and transfer it to the Jedi to power their abilities. Rather than being a single artifact this time, every Jedi has their own Kyber crystal that allows them to use the Force, though Obi-Wan lost his to Vader years ago, and his own energy has nearly depleted. But with all the things added to the script about the Force, one of the things that was removed was the idea of the Force as galactic vibes that could influence people's behavior on a subconscious level. In Castaneda's writings, mystical power was something achieved personally and didn't really influence the wider world. And since Lucas was using Tales of Power as a blueprint, the Force became less universal and more personal as well. So with the Force now strictly limited to individuals, it can no longer bolster the spirits of the rebel pilots at the end of the movie. So the idea of Luke using the Force to make the shot on the Death Star is finally added to give the mystical side of the story some bearing on the plot, with Luke using the Kyber crystal to channel the Force into his shot on the Death Star. The fourth draft, which is more or less what appeared on screen, gets rid of the crystal entirely. In his notes, Lucas said that the Kyber crystal made the characters too powerful, so taking the crystal away made them rely entirely on their own personal power rather than some magical trinket. And although there's some discrepancies about who exactly came up with the idea, this is also the version of the story where Obi-Wan is killed by Vader, complete with his ability to survive beyond death, which is reminiscent of the third draft's explanation of a creature's life force remaining in the mortal world after they pass on. The only other big change to the movie after the fourth draft was the title. The full title of the fourth draft is The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, as taken from the Journal of the Whills, Saga 1, Star Wars. Thankfully, the title would eventually be shortened to just the last two words, but it's interesting that this late into development, Lucas was still including mentions of the Whills, even though they never come up once in the movie itself. After Star Wars was released, it made enough money to warrant a sequel, though there was a desire to continue the movie's story in other mediums to keep people interested for the 3 years it would take for the next movie to come out. To help guide the authors who would take care of the universe while Lucas was working on the next major chapter, he provided backstory and world-building information, including information about the Force. In these notes, Lucas says that anyone could learn to use the Force, but that it takes a lot of training, and Luke is still a couple of decades away from mastering it. During the development of the Star Wars sequel, different ideas about the Force began to emerge. After a few days of story conferences with George Lucas in late 1977, screenwriter Lee Brackett's rough draft script plays with the idea of the dark side of the Force simply being the dark side of the wielder. But some of Lucas's other early notes go in a much more cosmic direction, suggesting that Luke could end up becoming a manifestation of the Force itself, or a weapon to be used by the good or evil sides of the Force in their battle for control of the universe. The idea of the two sides of the Force actively waging war against each other using living creatures like chess pieces is a pretty big departure from the Force that we know today, and seems to tie back into Lucas's ideas about the Whills as godlike entities that were observing the story. His notes also provide more information about how the two sides of the Force tend to operate. The good side is more passive and will subtly nudge a person towards their destiny, while the dark side takes more direct control, to the point where a person completely loses their free will. In fact, Lucas's thoughts about the series' backstory at this point involved Vader and the Emperor being essentially puppets for the dark side, with an idea for the third movie revolving around Luke trying to find a way to banish the dark entity that had taken over his father's mind. Obviously, none of this stuff ended up making it into the movie itself, and like the stuff cut from A New Hope's third draft, the Force is left more vague. Anger, fear, and aggression are equated with the dark side, but whether that's the dark side of the individual or some malevolent entity is left up to the audience to determine. The rough draft of Return of the Jedi seems to pick up the cosmic interpretation of the Force, though, with Obi-Wan warning Vader that if he becomes one with the dark side, he'll lose any trace of his individual identity. And speaking of Obi-Wan, the early drafts of what would become The Empire Strikes Back also go a bit further in explaining what exactly happened to him after his battle with Vader. In the rough draft, it's explained that Obi-Wan didn't die at all, that he simply moved to another part of the universe, one that Luke might be able to access as well if he can learn the physical laws that govern the way there. Jedi's rough draft gives this part of the universe the name of the Netherworld, a place between the world of the living and the Force itself, where Ben and Yoda reside after their deaths. Oddly enough, when Ben's ability to stay in the Netherworld expires, he actually returns as flesh and blood to the mortal world, reinforcing the idea that he was never actually killed in the first place. After Vader's eventual death, Ben explains that Yoda will attempt to rescue Anakin's spirit as it travels through the Netherworld and rescue him before he becomes one with the Force. Apparently, even though every living thing joins with the Force when it dies, there are reasons why someone might want to delay it in order to continue to interact with the world of the living. In the movie's development after the rough draft, the idea of the Netherworld is mostly abandoned, and the story reconceives Ben and Yoda's ghostly forms as a small part of the Force itself taking their form to interact with the mortal world, and that Ben's direct connection to the Force is able to cloud the perception of Vader and the Emperor. But like with the previous two films, none of this stuff actually made it onto the screen in Return of the Jedi. As the movie was further refined, the spiritual elements were changed to reflect the needs of the characters in the story, and any hints about the Force using the characters as weapons in a metaphysical war against the dark side were abandoned in order to strengthen the choices made by the characters themselves. And because all these extra explanations and ideas about the Force were left on the cutting room floor, the Force as actually depicted is a lot more abstract than maybe Lucas would have initially wanted it to be. But that also makes it more universal. By keeping it vague, it allows each person to decide for themselves what the Force is. And as Lucas's stewardship of the series came to an end for the first time, that gave it a lot of room to grow. Outside of the original films themselves, the largest influence on the development of the Star Wars universe was probably the tabletop role-playing game by West End Games. First published in 1987, the game and its supplements provided backstory information about various aliens, vehicles, and other pieces of technology that later authors would use to help flesh out their stories. Even the idea of a lightsaber operating by channeling energy through a crystal, which has become an integral part of Star Wars lore, originates in the RPG. And alongside these foundational ideas about the workings of the galaxy came foundational ideas about the workings of the Force. For the most part, the game's description of the Force is in line with what was in the movies, though there are a few differences. Whereas Lucas's version of the Force was just shy of explicitly being a quantifiable energy reserve that behaved according to observable, if esoteric, physical rules, the RPG's version of the Force was entirely mystical, even going so far as to say that the galaxy's focus on science and physical rules actually delayed the discovery of the Force, that those who sought to explain it would never be able to. The other big change the game made to the Force was inventing the light side. The dark side, of course, is all over the movies, but up to this point, even in his various scribbled notes and other behind-the-scenes material, Lucas had been very consistent about referring to the dark side's opposite as the good side of the Force, giving it an objective moral quality that the light side name lacks. The West End books, on the other hand, say that the light and dark sides of the Force are only a reflection of the light and dark parts of the natural world, giving them equal moral weight in the Star Wars universe. And it's this foundation of the light, the dark, and their cosmic equivalents that would inform all discussion about the Force for years to come, until the prequels. With the release of The Phantom Menace, George Lucas returned to Star Wars and returned to the Force with a few new ideas. The first, and the one that people usually find the most objectionable, is the idea of midi-chlorians. Microscopic life forms that act as a conduit between the Jedi and the Force are similar to Lucas's ideas about the Kyber crystals from A New Hope's third draft, but are altered to fit the movie's primary theme of different types of creatures learning to prosper by helping each other. But for audiences who had spent 18 years accepting the Force as something mystical and unknowable, midichlorians were a tough sell. Looking at it from Lucas's perspective, though, it doesn't really seem that jarring. He'd always treated the Force as something that was a part of the physical world, just slightly beyond the ability of most people to perceive. Whether it's Jedi absorbing life energy through crystals, or Ben Kenobi learning the physics of crossing universal boundaries, Lucas's conception of the Force has always been considerably more mundane than the audience's. The second new addition Lucas brought to the Force is the idea of balance and the prophecy of the Chosen One. While some early drafts of A New Hope opened with a prophecy from the Journal of the Whills, it was fairly generic, there will be a hero stuff, and the idea of the Force somehow being unbalanced was new as well. After all, hadn't the RPG established that the light and dark sides of the Force were just reflections of the natural world and would be balanced by default? Lucas's idea of balance might stem from his early ideas about The Empire Strikes Back, where the Force was in conflict with itself and waging a war for the fate of the galaxy. If that's the case, and if Lucas conceives of the Force as having a good side and an evil side, then balance would just mean an end to the conflict, with evil being banished. But after the movie came out, a fan theory began to gain traction about what exactly balancing the Force might mean. For people who had grown up with the opposite but equal interpretation, one side wasn't inherently more correct than the other, and there was no metaphysical conflict for the soul of the galaxy, so balance might mean strictly mathematical balance. After all, at the start of the original trilogy, there are only 2 Jedi and 2 Sith left in the galaxy. And it's this idea of balance, of light and dark in equal measure, that would eventually give rise to the idea of Grey Jedi. In the expanded universe, the term Dark Jedi generically refers to any Force user who uses the dark side, so the term Grey Jedi spawns from that. Though the term is largely used in fan circles to refer to a Force user who uses both light and dark abilities, it's been mentioned in actual Star Wars publications as well, the first time being a 2001 issue of Dark Horse's Star Wars comic series where Qui-Gon Jinn was thought of as a Grey Jedi due to his rebellious nature. But the idea would really start to be explored in the middle of the prequel era, with Matthew Stover's 2002 novel Traitor. In this book, Han and Leia's son Jason is captured by the alien Yuuzhan Vong and guided during his escape by an enigmatic former Jedi named Vergere. Throughout the book, Jason struggles with the dark side of the Force, while Vergere argues that the dark side doesn't actually exist, that it's only a convenient excuse that allows Jedi to blame their own inner darkness on some external corruption that isn't really their fault. Ideas like this aren't new, as we know they date back to the rough draft of The Empire Strikes Back, but Traitor was the first Star Wars story to really focus on that philosophy. And during early discussions of the book in fan circles, the conversations gradually shifted from talking about Vergere's philosophy of personal responsibility to discussing the morality of specific use cases of the Force. Was it an evil act when Obi-Wan took away someone's free will to ensure that a greater evil would be defeated? When Luke used the Force to guide his torpedoes into the Death Star's reactor, did he use the dark side to kill everyone aboard? What about the opposite? Could you use the Force to summon lightning and not be corrupted by the dark side? Video games had been letting players experiment with this for years, though 1995's Jedi Knight treated Force lightning as explicitly a dark side ability, and it would make the player character turn to the dark side if they used enough evil powers over the course of the game. But eventually the games would stop making evil a foregone conclusion for players who wanted to indulge in the dark side. 2000's Jedi power battles featured supposedly pious Jedi Council member Plo Koon blasting Force lightning with abandon, and Jedi Knight's own sequel, released a few months before Traitor, gave the player a full suite of light, dark, and neutral Force powers to use, even removing the first game's morally determined ending. No matter what your methods, at the end of the day, you're still a hero. This would change with the release of 2003's Knights of the Old Republic. The first video game version of the Star Wars role-playing experience, KOTOR used the player's actions to determine their alignment with either side of the Force as they helped or harmed people across the galaxy as they saw fit. One of these people would be the party member Jolee Bindo. Jolee is often referred to as a Grey Jedi, thanks to the alignment meter on his character page being almost exactly between dark and light, but the problem is that it isn't an alignment meter, it's a karma meter in the traditional sense. Karma is essentially a measure of a person's effect on the world around them, and thanks to Jolee living in exile on the forest floor of Kashyyyk, he has very little karma, only helping the occasional lost Wookiee or fighting against poachers. The droid T3M4 has similarly low karma. He's brand new when you buy him and hasn't yet had a chance to have an effect on the galaxy. But gameplay often trumps story in the minds of players, and because someone could deck Jolee out with light and dark abilities without penalty, the Grey Jedi descriptor form stuck, despite the fact that if left to his own devices, he will not take any dark side abilities during level up, and consistently endeavors to do the right thing during the game's story, even at great personal cost to himself. But even beyond Jolee, the game separated the player's story from their gameplay. Whether or not they succumbed to the dark side was decided entirely by the player themselves. They could kill old men for pocket change, steal from widows, even poison an entire planet's supply of medicine. But as long as they made one specific choice late in the game, they were still hailed as a hero by the galaxy. Another game released in 2003, Jedi Academy, would take a similar gameplay over story view of the duality of the Force. During the game's tutorial mission, the player character is mentored by the previous game's hero, and told outright that the Force isn't inherently good or evil, and it's how you use it that matters. The game still segregates light and dark abilities, but like Knights of the Old Republic, whether or not the character falls to the dark side is a single binary choice made by the player, rather than the culmination of their playstyle like the first Jedi Knight game had been. And it was into this environment that Knights of the Old Republic 2 was released. Designed to deconstruct not only the traditional Star Wars story, but also role-playing games in general, KOTOR 2 asked the player to more deeply consider the choices they were making, usually through the voice of Kreia, a Vergere-like mentor who hopes to turn the player character into a power gamer that uses whichever aspect of the Force will help them level up enough to break the game. And that's not a metaphor. The game's Jedi Masters specifically mention your ability to gain experience points from killing enemies as a monstrous, dangerous power, and Kreia draws attention to game mechanics like party control, the level up jingle, even equating the Force to the voice of the storyteller, calling out the franchise for creating Star War after Star War, where millions of people die just to service the story of a select few protagonists. Kreia wants to use the player to destroy the Force itself, and ensure that the galaxy is safe from future authors who would upset the balance of the galaxy for the sake of a story. So after years of the gameplay Force and the narrative Force being separate, they were finally reconciled. In KOTOR 2, being a Grey Jedi power gamer isn't just a strategy, it's a philosophy, one that would begin to get debated within the Star Wars universe as well as outside of it, using something called the Potentium. In the 2000 novel Rogue Planet, Anakin and Obi-Wan are sent to find Vergere after she cuts off contact with the rest of the Jedi during a mission shortly after the events of the Phantom Menace. They find her on a planet colonized by followers of the Potentium, an ideology that believed the Force was inherently life-giving and benevolent, and that it couldn't possibly have a dark side that coerced living beings into doing evil. Thanks to the novel's connection to Vergere, the Potentium philosophy would be used in later books as a proxy for the entire Grey Jedi idea, with authors having characters debate its merits or experiment with different types of Jedi from across the luminant spectrum. Even the Skywalkers got in on this, with Luke's crack-smoking fuckboy grandson using Force lightning as a defibrillator, and even Luke himself throwing bolts around from time to time. Eventually, the matter would more or less be settled when the 2007 novel Inferno concretely stated that Vergere, the character who most prominently represented the entire Grey Jedi idea, had secretly been a Sith Lord all along and made the whole thing up specifically to lure people to the dark side. So, while the method was a bit clunky, the Star Wars Expanded Universe had decided that, yes, Virginia, there is a dark side, and no, you can't have a little as a treat. But that wouldn't really be the final word on the Force, since George Lucas would return to the franchise with the Clone Wars animated series and dust off a few of his old ideas while he was at it. The third season of the show featured an arc set on Mortis, the mysterious home of a family of Force wielders, an angelic daughter, a demonic son, and their father, who had been attempting to keep balance between the two for thousands of years. After learning about the supposed Chosen One, Anakin Skywalker, the family lures him to their planet in the hopes that he will take the father's place and keep peace between his children. Now, interestingly, the father says that too much light or darkness would be the end of life in the galaxy, seemingly confirming the mathematical balanced interpretation of the Force, but as the story progresses, it becomes clear that he's only trying to convince Anakin to not just kill his son, who is unambiguously the villain of the story, and who the father constantly urges to resist the pull of the dark side at every opportunity. Eventually, the son does murder his sister and attempts to kill his father so he can take control of the planet and eventually the galaxy. In this story, which serves as a microcosm of the light versus dark conflict of the series, placing both sides on equal footing only allows the dark side to gain enough power to tip the scales in its favor and destroy the light forever. The Mortis arc would later be followed up in Season 6, with 3 episodes focusing on Yoda's journey to discover how to do a shitty-looking dissolve when you die. Whereas the early expanded universe had assumed that every Jedi disappeared upon death and could reappear as a spirit, we know that Lucas always considered it a specific skill that required a Jedi to either understand esoteric rules about the universe or get the help of someone who did. This arc of the Clone Wars showed how Yoda gained that understanding, with a little help from Qui-Gon, who only knew enough to manifest as a voice, rather than appearing physically. These episodes also tie in a number of Lucas's other early ideas about the Force. The idea of the force of others, the life force that creatures carry with them and leave behind when they die, is referred to as the living force, while the godlike destiny and will aspects are the cosmic force. The living force feeds into the cosmic force, and a person's journey from one to the other seems to be where the ability to become a spirit is manifested, as implied by early drafts of Return of the Jedi. The episodes also hint at the Force having specific goals and intentions, similar to the metaphysical cosmic war from Lucas's early ideas for Empire. The will of the Force was mentioned a couple of times by Qui-Gon in Episode 1, and in the Clone Wars, he says he was tasked with helping Yoda to discover the secret of life beyond death, so that the Jedi could continue to pass on their teachings in the event of their destruction. So the Force apparently wants the Jedi to survive, and it specifically asked Qui-Gon to help make that happen. And although these episodes would be released 2 years after Disney bought Lucasfilm, the long development time of the animated series means that these stories for this arc would have likely been developed right around the time Lucas was starting the process of selling his company, and right around the time he was writing his own outlines for a sequel trilogy. According to Lucas, his sequels would have explored more of this corner of the universe introduced in the Clone Wars and revisited the wills from his early notes. Lucas also revealed that the wills, at least his current conception of them, control the destiny of the universe and feed on the Force, essentially making them the aspect of the cosmic force that tasked Qui-Gon with teaching Yoda, and potentially turning the series back in the direction of those early notes for The Empire Strikes Back, where the good and evil sides of the Force were at war with each other, using beings of the galaxy as their unwitting soldiers. But, as we know, Disney didn't end up using these ideas, and the filmmakers responsible for the latest batch of Star Wars stories had their own ideas about the Force. The first entry into the Disney canon was the series Star Wars Rebels, which, helmed by Lucas's protege Dave Filoni, added a bit of fuel to the still smoldering Grey Jedi fire by introducing the Bendu, a mysterious creature that claims to lie between the light and dark sides of the Force, acting more as an avatar of nature and preferring to stay out of mortal affairs. The second thing Rebels would add to the canon of the Force is the world between worlds. Towards the end of the fourth and final season of the series, protagonist Ezra Bridger solves an ancient puzzle which unlocks a doorway to a realm that exists beyond the boundaries of time and space in the physical universe, a place similar to the Netherworld described by George Lucas earlier in the saga. Using one of the portals in this world between worlds, Ezra is able to glimpse into the past, to a battle between Darth Vader and Ahsoka Tano, which had occurred 2 seasons earlier and seemingly resulted in her death, until Ezra intervenes and pulls her to safety. But that doesn't mean Star Wars is about to use time travel to become a free-for-all on characters coming back from the dead, at least any more than it already is, because when Ezra decides to use the realm to save another Jedi, Ahsoka has to remind him that his friend's sacrifice meant Ezra's survival, and that removing him from the moment of his death would only result in Ezra dying instead. A near incursion by the Emperor also demonstrates the danger of this new aspect of the Force being widely available, and by the end of the episode, the portal into the world between worlds closes, potentially forever, leaving its footprint on the Force relatively small. The biggest impact on the Force would be on the big screen, starting with 2015's The Force Awakens. In this movie, the Force is reinterpreted less as the RPG's slow build of abilities and skills that had been the norm for many years, and more like a switch that's flipped in a person at a precise moment. The stormtrooper Finn has a Force awakening when he experiences the death of a friend during his first battle, and the scavenger Rey receives a psychic barrage when she first touches the long-lost Skywalker lightsaber. In both of these instances, the Force isn't something they seek out, something they have to accept. Rather than being Lucas's New Age karate, Episode 7's Force is Jesus, and all you have to do is accept it as your own personal Lord and Savior to be filled with its power. This certainly creates some interesting subtext for Kylo Ren's cross-shaped lightsaber, and speaking of Kylo, it seems that a bit of the old equal but opposite interpretation of the Force snuck in as well, with the light side being just as tempting for him as the dark is for others. The Last Jedi continued being the New Testament version of the Force, with Luke Skywalker giving Rey sermons on the Mount, and the movie even introducing actual holy books that Luke claims to follow but hasn't actually read. Episode 8 also continues the idea of balance being a tension between dark and light, rather than the dark itself being the imbalance, and it focuses on the cycle of life and death, creation and destruction as natural parts of the universe. This version of balance is demonstrated in the characterization of Luke himself, who, like Vergere, knew that a cosmic energy field was not an excuse for his own actions, and like Jolee, decided to reduce his karma through his own exile, and like Kyle Katarn, knew how to activate no-clip cheats. Even Luke's death points to a return to the expanded universe's view of the Force, with his ability to do a shitty dissolve not being treated as anything exceptional or requiring any specific training. But a new aspect of Jedi spirits is added in the third installment of the trilogy, or maybe an old aspect of Jedi spirits. In the rough draft of The Empire Strikes Back, Luke learned how to call Obi-Wan's ghost from the netherworld of the Force for guidance, and in The Rise of Skywalker, Rey is learning how to do the same. Continuing with the more Christian idea of the Force, Rey begins praying for guidance from heaven, hoping that some of its angels will appear to her in a time of need. Rather than the cosmic force being a collective unity where the idea of self is meaningless, The Rise of Skywalker posits that every living being has an individual soul, and that even when they pass on from the mortal world, some sense of them still exists. Whether or not the series will continue with this version of the Force is anyone's guess, but with Obi-Wan's Disney Plus series featuring several scenes of him praying to heaven for guidance, it seems that it might. But eventually, it'll change again. As different storytellers add their own perspective to the Force, it'll shift and evolve, because ultimately that's all the Force is, the storyteller's perspective. The invisible energy that exists in a realm beyond the character's mortal world that decides the fate of the galaxy and pits good against evil. It's just the imagination of anyone who's ever sat down and thought about what could happen a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So, when Han says, "That's not how the Force works," he's absolutely right. Or he's wrong, depending on who's telling the story. Because I guess the only answer to how does the Force work is however you want it to.